We will get started now as the last people funnel into the room. My name is Charlie Doobie, and I'm the head of Regenerative Partnerships at Agrology. We're really excited about this webinar. Really honored to have our friends from Napa Green. This webinar is on regenerative agriculture certifications, how they work and why they matter. And this is a really interesting and kind of complex and really nuanced space. So we're really excited to have some of the leading experts be here with us and help us navigate this space. Let's jump into the housekeeping slide, if that's okay, Anna. So please put yourself on mute. Everyone should already be on mute as they come in. And also feel free to turn off your video so that unless you want us to see you. Add questions and comments into the chat, please. We'll do an extended Q&A session at the end of some presentations. And, we really love to see a very lively chat and even people, jumping into a conversation or giving some feedback on questions or comments. We love to see all that. Additionally, the recording will be sent out, so feel free. You don't have to take notes. Both the deck and the actual video will be sent out in a follow-up email. Gonna admit these last people. And then, yeah, with no further ado, would love for Anna and Ben, if you guys could give yourself some introductions. And again, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Is my sound good?
Sounds great.
Sounds good. Okay, well, I'm Anna Brittain. I'm the executive director of Napa Green. I won't give a long bio, but my whole background is in environmental management and policy. I probably have close to 13 years now of experience specifically in the wine industry. I've been involved with Napa Green since 2015, and we became our own nonprofit in 2019, and that's when I became the executive director. And I see a couple other members of the team here in addition to Ben. They're going to ask us our toughest questions, I'm sure. But Ben, introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ben Mackie, the Vineyard Program Manager here at Napa Green. And I've been designing, managing, and even owning regenerative and organic farms for the last 15 years. For the last 2, I've been really focused on launching this next level vineyard certification with Napa Green. And it's really focused on climate action and regenerative agriculture and social equity. So I look forward to diving into that with you guys today.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to share a bit of a presentation. This is a webinar, but of course, what we really want to get into is a conversation with Charlie and with all of you. So we promise we're going to keep this to 15 to 20 minutes, but I think it's important to give a context if you're not familiar with us of what we're doing, what we're up to, and how we approach regenerative viticulture specifically. And you can see here that we really try to make those connections between sustainability and climate action and quality and experience, quality being very big in the agricultural sector and in the sector that we are in. And please do, like Charlie, if you have any questions as I'm going through this, or Ben, jump in anytime. I won't be thrown off. But I just like to always start with, sustainability has gotten to be a bit of a loaded term. And some people feel like it doesn't have a clear definition. It's amorphous. And so a few years ago, I kind of put my hand on the table and said, look, there really are 6 core pillars of leadership that anyone in the agricultural sector really needs to be working on to really call themselves leaders. So these are kind of the 6 core pillars that we work with all of our members on, and we'll talk a little bit, but we have both a vineyard and a winery program, so growers and vintners. We're working on water efficiency, energy efficiency, waste prevention and supply chain, what we call proactive farming, soil health, and biodiversity, a lot of what we'll be talking about today, social justice, diversity, and inclusion, and then climate action and regenerative agriculture. So I might say it 6 times in this presentation, we're really focused on a whole systems approach, and I think that is incredibly critical. One of the number 1 questions we get, and might already be in the chat, is, oh, is this organic, or how is it different from organic? That's one of the top questions we get. So this is kind of my little elevator pitch of how it is quite different. Organic is really just one small piece of the puzzle of what we're looking at. So in terms of environmental stewardship, organics just for the farm system, and it has a really clear to communicate message, which is don't use synthetic pesticides. Whereas we feel the truly sustainability leadership approach should be, as we call it, soil to bottle. So from the farm through production, and has an added focus on water and energy, on climate action, on social equity. We can talk more about this. We do have prohibited and restricted pesticides and herbicides, but we're more of sort of a pathway to organic in terms of that one element of our program. And there's kind of a lot here, but this is something we get asked for from time to time. So I threw it in here. And if you look at the slides after, you can maybe digest it a bit more. But this just gives a quick look at our vineyard and winery program versus regenerative organic, which we'll talk more about, and organic and biodynamic, and just gives a quick sense of just how whole systems of an approach that we're trying to take. And I'll talk more about the difference from ROC. We do have a number of our members that are also doing the regenerative organic certification. But maybe the main differences are, ours was developed specifically for the wine industry. And we do have both that vineyard side and the production side focus. And so happy to talk more about that. Ben, is there anything you want to add on that?
No.
I'm just going to ask Ben to jump in so I don't talk the whole time. So for our vineyard certification, our members have to implement more than 100 practices. We didn't plan it that way, but that's a nice round number that came up. And what I'm spotlighting here is the 6 elements of our vineyard certification. They largely parallel those 6 pillars, but there's some more specifics here. And I've put all in caps. If you're wondering why 3 of those are all in caps, these are elements of what we do that really make us a very, very unique certification program, in that most certifications will kind of hand you a set of standards, walk away, you got to figure out how to do it, find a consultant, whatever. And then a third-party auditor will come out and validate everything. Whereas we actually do a lot of on-the-ground, essentially consulting services, hand-holding services. And so that includes developing a regenerative carbon farm plan for every single one of our vineyard properties, doing an irrigation distribution uniformity assessment for all of our properties, and also doing demos and trainings around what's called climate smart burning and alternatives. So low smoke burns, flame cap kilns, air curtain burners. So some of the aspects of what we do that really set apart our work and all of the hand holding that we do with our members. And then we're not going to go too much into winery side today, but again, from a holistic standpoint, on the winery side, more than 120 practices. Some of them overlap, but some of them are very specific to the winery. And you can see focused again on those 6 pillars. So I think regenerative also is a term, certainly in the wine industry, we're hearing more people say kind of what they say about sustainability, which is like, oh, is this the next buzzword? What does it really mean? What's behind all of this? And so we did want to really be clear of the principles of what we're talking about when we're talking about regenerative agriculture. And actually, when I was looking up the latest definition, I really thought it was great to see one that first said context, right? Because context is so important. There isn't like a one size fits all approach. So I loved putting that at the top of the pyramid. But these are the other elements that we're looking at: the limiting disturbance, that's especially tied to tillage, armoring the soil, cover crops, compost, living roots, building biodiversity, and that's not just in the vineyard in our case, but around the vineyard, or not just in the farm system, but around the farm system, minimizing those chemical inputs, and also integrating animals, which is something that we're talking more and more about in the wine industry specifically. So I was just going to run through some photos, because photos are the best way to go through these things, of specifically some of the practices that we work with our growers on. And I throw this up here because first, a picture of a dog is a win, at least in my mind. But I also throw this up here because one of the things you might not notice, or someone who's not in the industry or not a farmer might not notice when you're standing in a vineyard, is the drip line there along the vines. And so the wine industry in general uses, you know, a lower amount of water relative to many agricultural crops, but it's still very critical, and actually particularly critical in the wine industry, that the right amount of water be delivered at the right time, because it's heavily tied to quality. And also in terms of regenerative ag, the more you're building soil health, the more you're building that water retention. So that's why we do those irrigation assessments with every single one of our growers, to make sure that they're really optimizing the efficiency of their irrigation, both for efficiency and for quality reasons. And then we also look a lot at compost. This usually is a couple different pictures in a row, but I couldn't make that work here. So what you're seeing here from above is a picture of actually a compost and biochar blend that's been applied. And I won't go too much into biochar unless anyone has questions about that, but that's increasingly being experimented with in the vineyard setting. But compost, obviously increasing those really happy, diverse microbes in the soil, increasing water retention, but also a really core way of storing more carbon in the soil. And then we also look a lot at different types of cover crops that can play a lot of different roles in terms of adding nutrients and water infiltration and water retention, and attracting beneficial insects that we want in the vineyard to get rid of the ones that we don't, like the little ladybug that you see here. But also, again, a really core way of storing more carbon in the vineyard. So you can see a theme emerging here in terms of what we work on. We also look at grazing, so adding nutrients naturally, if you know what I mean, and serving as natural lawn mowers, also reducing emissions, increasing soil health, increasing microbial diversity, and again, adding to that carbon sequestration. We also look, as I said, around the vineyard, so especially hedgerows. A number of our members have been working on planting hedgerows, and those can be really great for attracting birds that, again, serve as natural predators to things we don't want in the vineyard, attracting beneficial insects. Also, a lot more and more planting of pollinator habitat for those bees and butterflies that we still want to be seeing around the vineyard. And so we've worked with, we completely redeveloped our vineyard certification in 2021, has been said, to focus on climate action and regenerative carbon farming and social equity. And when we did that, we set this big, hairy, audacious goal, that's the BHAG, to work with our members to be carbon neutral in 6 years, and then climate positive or carbon negative in 9 years. So we're just a few years in, but we're looking forward to being really transparent about what we see as we continue to work with our members. And so why is all of this important? I'm sure everyone here probably knows this, but agriculture is so unique in the role it can play. It's been named by the International Panel or Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, say that 10 times fast, as one of the top 5 solutions to climate change, or these nature-based solutions. And so that's why we're really focused with our growers. It's really about building soil health and building resilience, and building these dynamic, resilient systems. But also at the same time, there's that win-win of sequestering more carbon in the soil. And we are a small piece of the agricultural picture, but we're really kind of at the peak of the agricultural pyramid in terms of the premium ag product that we make. And so we really want to set a leadership standard that can really influence and trickle down to the rest of agriculture. So I wanted Ben to just jump in and give a couple examples of what some of our members are up to. And Ben, anything else you want to add to all the stuff I just said?
Sure. I guess when looking at these members' case studies that I'm going to run through, it's a way of looking at the spectrum of implementing regenerative practices. So one reason that folks get a little confused about the definition of regenerative agriculture, one of the reasons, is that it's not a clear, like, cookie cutter prescription for every location. And so putting that context piece at the top of that pyramid is really looking at the design, looking at the ecosystems in which you farm, and looking at your ability to implement different practices. And then it's also not a static state. And so, like, certifying something as regenerative is a little bit of a misnomer, because you're really constantly adapting to what you're seeing from your agro ecosystem. And so, one of the great idioms of agriculture is the best fertilizer is a farmer's footsteps. And that's really based around observation. And so you really need to be out in the field and seeing what your system is telling you to be able to interpret that into what you need to do next as a conscious steward of the land. So I'm going to run through 3 different operations that we're working closely with on getting certified. One is fully certified, 2 are about to get after harvest. And so I'm going to start kind of showing the spectrum. And so with Pine Ridge Vineyards, the ones that is pulled up now, they manage 160 vineyard acres over 11 different sites. I know them well because I did all 11 carbon farm plans. And that's all the way from Carneros in the south up to Angwin at, like 1,700 feet in elevation. They've started moving away from herbicides. They don't use it on any of their Stag's Leap properties, and they're really moving away from any herbicides on any location that they are looking for increased quality, because in viticulture, it's one of the aspects of agriculture where you actually get paid for higher quality, and they really see that connection between herbicides and moving away from herbicides and increasing quality. And so they're doing more cultivation or even just undervine mowing on those sites. They also were previously just using compost tea as their main fertilizer. And through some grant processes, we're able to help them bring down the cost of solid compost, and they were able to spread it on about 1/3 of their acreage last dormant season. And they've implemented a plan to do that every 3 years, try and hit each site with solid compost to, all the benefits of compost, which we don't need to go into right now. They also, through our RISE symposium, which we didn't really cover, but we have a symposium every other year touching on the 6 pillars that Anna mentioned, and really intensively investigating each pillar on a separate day. And through that process, there's a mentor-mentee relationship where folks can get free consulting from a peer to implement one very specific aspect on their acreage or in their organization or in their winery. And one that came out of this was Pine Ridge was replanting a vineyard, and they partnered with Dominus, who I'm going to talk about next, who dry farms, and they established it through that mentorship educational program to be managed, to be dry farmed long term. And then as far as carbon goes, one of the most exciting parts that we see is that they started managing their forest for forest health and resilience for, low intensity fires, and just reducing the fuel loads within those ecosystems. They got some funding through the North Bay Forest Improvement Program, and they've been working closely with the Napa RCD, and that all came out of our vineyard certification process. So next we're going to talk about Dominus Estate, which is they make very high quality wine. They have 2 sites in Yountville, one of which is right on the edge of town. It's actually pretty close to where the first vines were planted in Napa County by George Yount once upon a time. And they're entirely dry farmed. And so they only water their vines for the first 3 years during establishment. And then they're really training those vines to root very deeply and get that subsurface water throughout the year to sustain themselves. And traditionally in dry farming viticulture, it was managed, the soil management is dust mulching, which means just tilling it a lot to try and break those capillaries so they're not losing any water out of the soil through transpiration. But they have seen through some RISE educational opportunities, they were actually realizing that there are some downsides to that, particularly the soil structure and health. And so they started implementing reduced till or no till within the alleyways in some portions and tracking that over time. Some other aspects that they've implemented is grazing. That's been a big part in Napa over the last 5 years. It's seen an explosion. So we've seen a lot of different grazing operations come through Napa. And they're also really dedicated to the pollinator and biodiversity habitat through hedgerows and a small riparian habitat running through their main site. And then the next one that we're going to talk about is Gurgitch Hills. And so a lot of a lot of folks in the spectrum are what I would say is implementing regenerative practices. But some of the sites, so Gurgitch Hills has 5 sites from all the way from American Canyon up to Calistoga, which is basically the whole Napa Valley. And some of those sites that go out, and it's like truly regenerative systems. It is, if you were a bird, if you were a microbe, if you were an insect, you would want to live in these viticulture systems, I promise. They integrate biodiversity everywhere. They're also ROC certified, CCOF. They implement biodynamic practices. They're no longer Demeter certified from what I understand. And they've also been partnering with Advancing Eco Ag to increase their vine health through foliar sprays and that whole kind of management regime. I think that John Kemp's actually going to be in a agrology webinar moving forward, so you guys can talk to him then. But their entire management is no-till under vine and in the alley. They just mow under vine, and they do very minimal irrigation. And in some of these vineyards, they have like 100-year-old vines, and they've actually seen, whereas those are often declining in health, through these practices, they've seen them increase in health. And like the spectrum that I was talking about implementing regenerative practices, they make their own compost, but they're actually moving away from using compost because they don't see the need anymore. They've been using it for 10 years and they think that their soil is at a point where they can sustain the vines, and just really reducing their use of compost. So really thinking about that kind of trajectory where you just need to really do that observation to inform your practices, because sometimes you can move past what you thought was required in the past. And so these vineyards have beehives, and they have owl boxes and bird boxes, and they're doing studies on all the different things. So this is just kind of one of those pinnacle examples of regenerative viticulture that I've seen. And so if you ever get a chance to go see, especially like the American Canyon or their Yountville sites, like definitely take advantage of that, because it's impressive systems out there.
I want to just jump in with 2 things that occurred to me, Ben, as I was listening to you. I'm anticipating a question in terms of the Dominus case study of why aren't all vineyards dry farmed? I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding among some people, thinking that you can just turn off the taps, like, oh, I'm going to dry farm now, no more irrigation. And actually, it's something you have to plan from the very beginning of planting a vineyard. I assume any agricultural system, you really have to plan your orientation, your rootstock, your trellis system. All of that really has to be planned from the very beginning in order to dry farm. And so that's something that Dominus did, was very intentionally design their system. And that's why they could then work with Pine Ridge in a replant to really plan from the very beginning, from the underground up, to be dry farmed. So I just wanted to mention that. And then a really wonderful thing about Gurgitch, this relates to one of your earlier webinars about the return on investment of regenerative ag. They have fabulous numbers showing the economic case for the farming practices they're doing, and particularly the longevity of their vineyards, and so the reduced depreciation. And so in a lot of different things, we talk about thinking about ROI in new ways, and I think sometimes that's one that people aren't thinking about, is the depreciation if your vineyard's turning over every 20, 25 years. So I just want to throw those 2 things in there.
Yeah, and on the dry farming, it comes back to context. It has to be very site specific. You can't do that on every site. Before drip irrigation, everything was dry farmed, but you could only grow grapes in specific locations. And now that we have the ability to irrigate, it can be planted pretty much anywhere. I do want to jump in on a couple of these questions in the chat. Stephanie, you asked, how are you modeling, estimating, measuring CO2 emissions, sequestration, and storage? So we, through the carbon farm planning process, we utilize the COMET tool, which was developed by the USDA and Colorado State to estimate the sequestration of different practices. So we baseline where everyone's practices are at, like in the past, and then we give them a whole suite of recommended practices that they could implement to increase their carbon sequestration. And then also, so that is one piece of it that's very estimate based, but it's the best tool that we have currently. And then we also require soil sampling regularly to track those changes over time, but we all know that that's a very slow process. Carbon accumulation in the soil is, decades long. And so we're also piloting a study, not to plug them too hard, but with agrology to really to use their arbiter systems to be able to see those carbon fluxes, even minute by minute, to be able to track people's soil management over time. So you can see the effect that a tillage pass, grazing, even irrigation has on that soil fluxes throughout the day. And it's another tool in the toolbox for stewards of vineyards to be able to inform their decisions. So just data gathering so that they can make the best decisions for their agroecosystem. The Stacy asked why Pine Ridge doesn't take away all herbicides on their operations, and that's mainly due again to context. So on flat open vineyards, it's really easy to, or relatively easy to move away from any herbicide usage as long as you have the tools available. But on some very steep locations or very rocky soils, it can be challenging, especially during establishment of vines, like the first 3 years, like I was talking about. It can be really challenging to keep those vines from getting outcompeted by either weeds or even the cover crop that you plant. And so and it also comes back to the availability of the tools and the time that they have to manage it. One more, should we just keep going with questions here?
Yeah, I love it. Keep shooting.
Okay. Do you know if the biodiversity measures like hedges, flower strips, etc., actually pay off? I assume the maintenance cost is costly. So yes. Providing habitat for natural predators, especially of specific pests to vines, is really essential. So I actually included this photo of Gurgich. I'm glad it's still up. The upper right one looks a little messy, but that in the middle is buckwheat, and they plant that every 10th row as a host for a predator of the main pest that they deal with, which is vine mealybug. And so they are planting this, and they're actually irrigating it. They don't use that much water for the vines, but they are actually irrigating the cover or the flowering cover crop to provide habitat for those predators. And they've actually company-wide at replant, they're dedicating 4 rows of every block to get irrigated for just pollinator habitat. So they're actually taking vines out of production because they do see the ROI on that very clearly. Just gonna keep going here. Stacy asked, but curious, when folks go no-till, why is it still common practice to till under the vine? This is a 2-part issue for young vines. It's a competition issue, certainly, both for nutrients and for water. And one big piece in viticulture that we talk about a lot is aesthetics, especially for vineyards around a winery or something. People that come there have a certain, managers assume that people who come there have a certain look in their mind that they're going to want to see, which is clean under vines, and then no-till in between if that's what they're doing. And so that's another piece that we're trying to educate folks around, or get the conversation going, is like weeds aren't ugly.
Yeah, I think that is a big conversation piece, is that like changing what we consider beautiful. And I love, someone said like weeds are just a human construct, right? So we were talking yesterday about make weeds great again. So
Yeah.
There's some issues of potential competition, but really there's a lot of more subjective ways of looking at it. But yeah, Charlie,
I was just going to say, I would love to like double click on that and just kind of zoom in. How do you see Napa Green and just overall kind of regenerative certifications as doing that sort of, it's like culture making, or kind of shifting the story, shifting the paradigm or the lens through which we view agriculture? I've seen that not only in vineyards, but really across ag. There's really that concept that like a clean field is a productive field, and it has to look a certain way, and it has to have straight lines and no weeds, and otherwise like a messy field is bad or almost disgusting. How do we move beyond those sort of cultural paradigms and really, like you were saying, see weeds as beautiful, or starting to just reshape and let go of these lenses that are really they can be quite detrimental in this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'll say, Ben, I know you have a lot to say about this, but I think that's one of the reasons we're really very proud to have redeveloped our vineyard certification in 2021. We're the first specifically sustainable wine growing program globally to do that, because we recognize this need to really focus on climate action and regenerative carbon farming very specifically. And so, having standards specific to that, developing resources, doing these hands-on carbon farm plans, that is part of shifting that and having those conversations and getting that dialogue going. I wish we had another photo here from Gergich. He has a photo from his American Canyon vineyard where it's like, it looks like the weeds are taking over, but they've done the tests and the vines are doing great. But he said, most of my peers would think I was absolutely ready to go to the loony bin for so it really is these conversations. But Ben, what more would you say to that?
I'd say one of the biggest things that we can do is provide the space for the peer-to-peer, farmer-to-farmer learning and learning from each other, because oftentimes folks are just stuck in their vineyard, not looking over the vine row. So through the RISE Symposium and through other educational opportunities like workshops that we provide, that's one of the biggest values that I see for making this type of change, is really getting folks in the same room to talk to each other, talk to their neighbors, see what they're doing, because they don't want to be the first one to do it. But if they see successes and they see the value from other viticulturalists within their industry, that's when you can really get the change happening. And once several people do it, it just becomes normal. It's like grazing in the dormant season. It was pretty unique a decade ago, and now it's almost like standard practice to have sheep come through in the winter to do basically a tractor pass, but also the ecosystem cycling that you would see through a grazing animal. So it's really that peer-to-peer learning that I think is the most vital there. Like, we can tell them all we want, but at the end of the day, I'm not managing a vineyard, and so if we can just get those people in the same room, I find that to be the most effective.
I love that. I really love that. And I think that's something really unique of agriculture. In a lot of other industries, people are very secretive with their latest and greatest kind of R&D. But in agriculture, and I think really, especially in vineyards, there's just this real openness to collaboration and to sharing, which I think is really, unique and really powerful. It reminds me a little bit of John Kempf has this great quote that I like using all the time, where he says that regenerative agriculture is really about regenerating relationships, and not only regenerating relationships between, the vines and the soil microbiome, but also regenerating relationships between neighbors, regenerating relationships between the consumer and the place where their crops or their wine is grown. So yeah, I really love that. And you guys, I think, do such an amazing job of facilitating those conversations, within the RISE Symposium, but also outside of it. I had a question, a specific one about, can you talk a little bit more about, I have my theory, but why you think there is an increase in quality when herbicides are reduced or eliminated? Like, for example, you talked about how Gergich has these photos where the weeds are basically taking over the vines, but they have some of that highest quality grapes. What do you think's going on there?
Well, I'll jump in on two things. There's this concept, especially strong in the wine industry, about terroir, about place, about grapes really expressing this microclimate where they're coming from. And if you're dampening that real expression of those soils, the health of those soils, that microbiome there, the party going on underground, the brain of the vine is underground, right? And so you're taking away some of that terroir. And I think that as you eliminate those synthetic inputs, you're enabling that true terroir to really begin showing again. And it just reminds me to mention a study a couple of years ago out of UCLA where they looked at more than 75,000 wine rankings. And they found that those made with organic grapes specifically and biodynamic ranked on average 4 points higher than their conventional counterparts. So I'd love to see more studies like that, where you're really starting to see that quality connection. But Ben, what are your thoughts?
Honestly, my thoughts are coming back to the AEA, kind of the John Kempf photosynthetic pyramid. Like, once you start taking away the chemicals that are breaking down a lot of those microbiome connections, you increase the efficiency of the plant. And not only to make fruit, but make higher quality fruit because of the metabolites that are included. And so you have like a thicker cuticle around the leaves and a thicker skin around the grapes. And those make them more resilient to pests and disease and make them more efficient. And all of those pieces coming together and making like a healthier system within the vine is going to just increase quality in any crop. Not just grapes, but grapes are the one that people test quality constantly and where you get paid for the higher quality, like I mentioned. So it's
Great.
yeah.
Another specific one on that, and I'm going to leave this question very open-ended for you, Anna, but I heard you in a podcast a few weeks ago speaking a little bit about Roundup, and I was wondering if you could just touch on that. It's a little bit of a flashy question, or, it can be a bit controversial, but if you could just speak a little bit about kind of what your thinking is around that.
Oh, you had to lob the hard question at me. It's one of the, it's really become this kind of flashpoint. It's the area of sort of most awareness among consumers and among the media. And I think a really important thing to note there that I think a lot of people don't realize is there's a whole universe of herbicides. Roundup is just one. And many of those other herbicides, I mean, there's 10 plus herbicides that can commonly be used in the wine industry alone. Have higher risks. I think Roundup should be illegal. Absolutely. They should make it illegal. But when we talk, we try not to talk about Roundup. We need to be thinking about all herbicide use. And so not just thinking about that one issue. And a reason it's also become a little bit of a hot button for me, I guess, is because I have this concern about missing the climate for the weeds, as I call it. I think I talk to a lot of growers that say, I'm organic, that's it. I'm the ultimate grower, I'm the ultimate farmer. And in terms of what we need to do for climate action and social justice action, it's really not even a huge impact relative to all the other practices that we need to do. So you can be organic, but not be taking care of your team and have terrible water use and terrible energy use and an incredibly high carbon footprint. And 900 gram bottles and all of those things. So again, I'm saying for the fourth time, we really have to take a whole systems approach. But I will also say, stay tuned. We do have a big announcement coming out in a few weeks specifically around Roundup and herbicide use. So stay tuned for that. But Ben, anything you want to add on that fun, controversial topic?
I think I'll pass. I think you covered it well. We do have some
thanks.
Questions.
We have a bunch more questions in the chat. I think that I'm gonna give you guys a few and then we're gonna just jump right in. We still have 20 minutes, so we still have a good amount of time to get all these questions, and I want everyone to know we will get to these questions. And thanks, Anna, for allowing me to lob a tough question at you, and I really appreciated your nuanced answer, because I think that nuance is really, there's not only a lot of wisdom there, but that is it resonates, and I'm sure it resonates with a lot of people. Speaking of sort of just this whole systems approach and the context approach, I was wondering if you just speak a little bit about the support you give your members in terms of like forest management, just looking outside of the vineyard, really looking at the landscape that it's interwoven in. I know that Dominus is starting to lead a really interesting project looking at some watershed, regeneration and restoration. But if you could just speak a little bit about kind of how you see not only the certification, but also just the community building of Napa Green vineyards working together to look at the whole landscape and regenerate at a watershed level.
Yeah, I think as we were redeveloping the vineyard standards in 2020 and 2021, we had just had 3 mega fires in the past 3-4 years. And so my mom had 2 houses burned down. So that was very much on our mind in redeveloping the standards. It was having that element specifically around forest health and fire resilience. And I think as all these community panic and conversations were happening around the fires and fire recovery, there was a realization too of a lot of people just think more trees is better. And that is not necessarily the case. What we need is healthier forests. And at least here in Napa County, a lot of the forests are not healthy and they're way over dense, and firs have taken over a lot of stands. And so we really wanted to focus on that element of trying to help a lot of our vineyard members have adjacent forest properties, and really thinking about that forest management. I think it was a huge realization for me, at least, as we rolled out the new standards. Like, I didn't have a really good grasp on just how much private forested land there was that wasn't being managed, and just how expensive it is. I mean, that's why a lot of people aren't managing it. Doing that fire fuel thinning is incredibly expensive. And so that's why, you know, Ben talked about with Pine Ridge, because they do have quite a bit of forested land, starting to try to help identify, especially those funding sources, like the North Bay Forest Improvement Program, if I'm getting that acronym right, to really help do some of that forest planning and fire fuel resilience. I'll quickly say, yeah, I'm very excited about a partnership that we have with Todd, who's the vineyard and winemaking director over at Dominus, but he's also formed a little foundation called Abuelitos. And what we're looking at is trying to do a kind of creek and forest restoration pilot that we hope could serve as sort of a model for a broader watershed restoration approach. And I won't talk too much more, I promise, but I think one of the things we're hoping we might replicate or partially replicate is that Ben and I were lucky enough to go over to the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians. They burned in the Kincaid fire and they needed to do fire recovery. And they, again, got a timeline and a prescription that was so expensive and so long, and it wasn't doable. And so they tried to really rethink their approach and ended up doing in-place chipping, which is raises some people's hackles, but is a way to do it a lot faster and a lot quicker and a lot more cost effectively, and build mulch in place, which can then rebuild water stores in the soil and inoculate those chips, so they break down very quickly. And so they showed a more kind of cost-effective, ecologically effective method of doing some of this forest health work and fire recovery work. And so we're hoping to replicate that in the pilot. That might have been a longer answer than you wanted, but I'm very passionate about this topic.
No, that's great. Ben, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, just a brief historical perspective. We're basically running, like, we're still living off of the accrued savings from millennia of indigenous management. And so we've kind of broken the systems to the point where they can't be sustainably managed. And so we need to partner with landowners to find those funding sources to try and repair these systems, because the forests are to the point where we can't do it efficiently without a lot of input. It hasn't been burned, you know, in 150 years or something. It hasn't been managed by large herbivores that, you know, we hunted out. And so, like, there's all these pieces that need to be rehabilitated before we can even, you know, sustain them. They need to be majorly addressed before they're at a point that is sustainable.
Yeah, I think that's
Amazing.
a really point. Like, as we've been talking more about, let's get back to some of these indigenous methods, people have been talking about, like, oh, let's just go back to prescribed burns everywhere. And it's like, actually, a lot of this forested land is not healthy enough to have a prescribed done on it. So we need to rebuild the health before we can actually do some of those indigenous methods and bring them back.
Amazing. Yeah, I really, really love those answers. There's so much to pull out there, but we have a lot of questions from the participants here, so I'm going to move on to that. But if anyone wants to learn more about what Ben was referencing in terms of really the California landscape being a landscape that was, you know, the Spanish arrived and they thought, oh, what a beautiful Eden. This is amazing. But it was really a garden. The entire thing was really tended for thousands of years. There's an amazing book that I can recommend called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. So a lot to dig into there. But we'll jump into some of these questions because there's some amazing questions that are coming up in the chat. So one from Jose was, is there damage to the fruit or vines when integrating pasture animals or grazing? And I would also love if you could chat a little bit about, I learned something really amazing at the Rye Symposium about the enzymes that are in the sheep saliva and how that, you know what I'm talking about. So I'll let you run with it.
Yeah,
Sure.
Ben.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
jump in on this one. So in general, when we're talking about grazing in the vineyard, it is during the dormant season when there's no active growth on the vines, and it's generally by sheep. We definitely have visited places that utilize cows or even pigs in some situations, but in general, when we're talking about grazing in the vineyard, it is during the dormant season just by sheep eating the cover crop. And there is certainly some damage that can occur, but it really comes back to management. And so you need to have a good shepherd that is managing the flock efficiently and keeping them moving. It's usually high density, so a lot of animals in one place for a short amount of time so that they eat all of the cover crop effectively. And then, yeah, what Charlie was just referencing is a study that really comes back to the relationship that plants have with the animals that they co-evolved with. And so when a grazing animal nibbles on a plant, it's a very different process that the plant goes through than if it just gets mowed. There's enzymes in the sheep mouth that creates a system within the plant that actually makes it more resilient moving forward. It thickens cuticles, it puts more energy into the soil. It does a lot of benefits that aren't captured just by the fact that they're preventing a tractor pass. They're actually increasing the resilience and the health of that viticulture system.
Amazing. I mean, talk about real life magic. I just love when there's whole systems moments like that. And actually that made me realize we should probably look into that with the agrology arbiter system. That could be a really interesting side by side looking at what is happening in terms of the sloughing into the roots and the carbon energy that's getting moved into the soil system. But that is for another day. Another question we have is, have you worked with anyone who is using under vine cover crops? We're piloting this in Ontario, but we don't have drip irrigation, so the system presents different challenges, and that's from Stephanie.
I know Ben will have a response to that, but I just have to make a plug, Stephanie, that I've actually been working with Ontario craft wineries on expanding their sustainable wine growing program. So we're actually a little involved in Ontario. So if that's something you want to learn more about, reach out. But Ben, yes, we definitely have people using undervine.
Definitely. And it's really comes down to species. And so Ontario, it would be a different situation. Well, I guess in Ontario, you would want something that is more of a cool season grass so that it's not growing actively or not trying to grow as much during the growing season of the grapes. And so in California, we're looking at more native grasses to go under vine that go dormant but have roots in the soil under the vine during the growing season, which is the summer here when it never rains. And so it's something that can like regenerate in the fall, but will go dormant in the spring naturally. And so you just want to be conscious with the species that you choose so that you're not battling against it. You're using the imbued values of that plant to increase your system.
That's great. That actually brings up a question that I had, which is, does Napa Green plan to expand beyond wine or beyond Napa County? And what does the future hold for Napa Green?
You're lobbing another tough question. Okay, Charlie.
It's my job. It's what they pay me for.
I think our specialty really is in the wine industry, although we have had some interest from some other perennial crops where a lot of the regenerative practices, I think all of the regenerative practices we're working on are applicable to things like almonds or pistachios. So we have had that conversation about, could there be potential to help sort of adapt our standards to other sectors and sort of serve as consultants in that process? That isn't happening yet, but that's something we've thought about. I think more than that moving beyond Napa is something that is in our vision and strategic plan. There's a lot of fundraising and a lot of capacity building that has to happen in order for us to do that. But we have a lot of members that have vineyards be outside of Napa County, and they want us, and wineries outside of Napa County, and they want us to be able to work with them beyond Napa. So that is something we're hoping to move toward in the next few years, but it's always hard to say as a nonprofit. It might surprise a lot of you to hear that we're just a 5-person team with a few consultants. We're already doing like 2 or 3 people's work each. So we've got to increase our capacity to keep doing more work.
Wow, I didn't actually know that, and I'm very impressed. Amazing. One question I had, we have a lot of folks in in the chat and with us who are part of the wine industry, and we also have a lot who are outside of the wine industry. And I was wondering, given your experience and your expertise, what's your 30,000-foot view on sort of the larger emergent space of regenerative ag certifications, and where the next 5 years might take us? For example, do you imagine that there'll be sort of a global or national standardization of what regenerative agriculture is defined as similar to what has happened with certified organic? Or yeah, if you could just zoom out and sort of speak a little bit about what you see in the space in general.
Ben and I are both going to have some involved responses to this question.
Perfect.
I would say this is really a thing of mine is I'll get to conferences or summits and people say, oh, there's hundreds of sustainability certifications, or, oh, there's hundreds of regenerative certifications. That really isn't true. So it's important to be pretty specific in differentiating between like a very specific environmental certification, like something focused on fish or organic, right? That's a kind of more narrow. Sustainability, not all sustainability certifications are focused really intensively on regenerative practices. So in terms of regenerative ag specifically, it's a growing space, but it's not actually like a hugely crowded space in terms of certification. So I think that's important to note. And I think regenerative organic certification really kind of having the biggest growth right now. We see our benefit as having been developed really specifically for the wine industry and providing an immense amount of hand-holding and support, as I've said, which is not something some of these other programs provide. But I think the nice thing about ROC is that can be kind of a umbrella overarching standard that might, the organic piece might be hard for some people, but is a little bit more of a sort of centralizing conversation in regenerative. But Ben, what would you add to that?
Yeah, the uniqueness of Napa Green is really being focused not only on the industry, but the ecosystems that our members are farming in. And so I think that, again, going back to the context piece, I think that's so essential to any sort of regenerative certification or practices. Like what is happening in Ontario is going to have a different set of, ideally a different set of practices than what's happening in California, because we're thinking about forest fire. Oh, sorry, I think that was Quebec that had the forest fires. But anyway, we're thinking about forest fires. We're thinking about efficiency of water use and irrigation. And like in Ontario, it's going to be a whole different suite of issues that they'll be addressing. And so having like a national standard, like the extremely watered down national organic certification standards that are like having an organic hydroponic system doesn't even make sense. There's no carbon, like organic, like come on. So anyway, I don't think that a national like watered down regenerative standard is going to benefit anyone except for large companies and being able to put that stamp on it. I'd much rather see like the regional. It's harder for the consumer to understand, but having those regional context for all of these different aspects of agriculture and having that whole systems view for each ecosystem in which you farm is absolutely essential for a regenerative system. And so I just don't see that being applicable to all 50 states at once.
That might be a good moment. I remembered I had one more slide as you're mentioning the consumer. Charlie, is it okay if I just talk through this one more slide?
Absolutely. Take it away.
A lot too much text here. I got to work on that. But I just wanted to do a small conversation piece about something we talk about in much more depth with our members, but it's just how much market interest there is, consumer interest there is in supporting, using their purchasing power to support values-driven products and businesses. And there's study upon study upon study, but I think I pulled in just this one sustainable market share index that NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business does almost every year now. And they look at more than, I think it's more than 75,000 SKUs of consumer packaged goods and those that are sustainably marketed versus conventional. And just the growth that is seen in this space. So we don't want this to be like the only reason anyone is doing these practices, but their consumers want to support these businesses that are really investing in climate action and in social equity and in sustainability. And that is one of the reasons we certainly see some of our members come to the table is my distributors asking for this, my retailers asking for this, whoever that might be. So that growing market interest is an important piece. But then, as Ben said, it is very hard to communicate the difference between these different programs and the rigor and the substance of these different programs. That's a never-ending challenge of ours. And I will say I saw someone, so I'll jump in on it quickly, asking about the difference between regenerative organic. I didn't kind of explicitly go through it in that side-by-side slide I put up. So the real difference between our program and regenerative organic is regenerative organic certification is just for the farm, and it was not developed specifically for viticulture. And so we also have all of these kind of production side standards and work that we do. But we do have a lot of similar emphasis in terms of the regenerative practices that we work with our members on. The social equity, they do have the social equity standards. I think ours are a little deeper. I think they go a little deeper on some of the animal integration. That's definitely a conversation we have. And then we don't require organic. So those are kind of the core differences between us and regenerative organic.
Thanks for that. One question I had, I mean, you've got some amazing stats here, and that got my mind thinking about just kind of quantification in general, both quantification of ROI and quantification of impact on soil health or carbon in the soil. How do you guys see technology, different types of technologies, as helping in irrigation monitoring, carbon monitoring? Like, how does technology play a role in this?
Ben, you start.
Sure. I honestly, not to plug you too hard, but I think the agrology arbiter sensor is one of the biggest tools that you can do for real-time carbon monitoring and seeing what you're every time you touch the soil, what's happening. And as far as irrigation technology, it's absolutely essential to be able to precisely measure and control your irrigation. But honestly, you can't do that efficiency if your system isn't running efficiently. And so that's why we partner, or we also do the irrigation distribution uniformity assessments to make sure the actual plumbing is working well before you start trying to do like deficit irrigation or, using any automation in that system. And so I think it needs, like any technology needs to be paired with either ground truthing, walking the vineyard, or some practical application as well. It shouldn't just be a panacea that just gets put on. So
Yeah,
that makes sense. Anna, do you have anything?
I think we just get approached by so many like new and existing tech tools, and we do our best to try to vet and really understand. There's so much, I would say, a number of really valuable tools around optimizing irrigation. So we definitely, that's a space we really focus on in the vineyard, is using tools like Thule and Ranch Systems and Lumo and others to really optimize the timing and amount of irrigation. And then I don't think we sort of explicitly said it, but yeah, we're partnering with agrology, having really gotten to know you guys. We haven't been paid to say this, to do a pilot with 4 of our members with the Sentinel and Arbiter tools. Of course, as Ben said, really seeing carbon changes is a longer term process, but to really start to ground truth the value of that real-time carbon flux data for our members. And we'll definitely share the results of that at the end of the year. We're really just getting started at the end of the year of the pilot. We're really just getting started right now. So we do really try to help our members identify the most valuable tools and where we can, like this opportunity, really to pilot some of those tools.
Yeah, we're really excited to be working with you guys on that one. There's a great question from Lillian. I love this question. Are buyers/retailers supporting regenerative growers and wineries with financial incentives and premiums?
The short answer is not really. I do think that's a big thing. We, especially in this space, have more growers saying, man, I should be getting a price premium for investing in these regenerative practices, these climate action practices. there's some data saying that people will pay more, but it's hard, that like reality on the ground of what people actually do is harder to see. We definitely work with our members to identify incentives that are out there. Various rebates and, Healthy Soils, California Department of Food and Agriculture, sweep grants around irrigation efficiency. But in terms of directly like the market and retailers and buyers, there aren't really incentives being offered right now. It's more those market signals that are happening that are incentivizing some change.
And the quality.
And the quality, yes.
They do get paid for the increased quality that comes with implementing these practices. And there's a new innovative way for consumers to directly support grazing in the vineyard. And that's a partnership with Gergich and Fibershed is piloting the system based on blockchain to be able to, for consumers to be able to just donate $1 to $5 or whatever in the tasting room to then directly support the cost of grazing in the vineyard. So it's kind of a new innovative way that people are just launched like last month for consumers to directly be able to support these practices.
I actually just randomly ran into that on Regen Network, and I was like, "Oh, well, look at that! I can buy a carbon credit from Gergich."
Yeah, it's like a carbon credit, but like more of an ecosystem credit,
Yeah, exactly. Moving beyond the carbon tunnel vision, as they say. Well, we're at the top of the hour here. I'm not going to cut it off unless Anna and Ben, do you guys have to run immediately? I was going to maybe give us another 5 minutes of questions.
Sure.
But if anyone else has to go, thanks so much for joining us. Again, the recording of this will be sent out, and we really look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. But there's a few more questions from the crowd here. One was, how do you look at water use practices to determine efficiency? And what tools or technologies do you recommend for achieving crop quality while minimizing the water footprint? How does this extend into the winery?
Ooh, that's a big question. That is one thing we didn't touch on that is important to touch on and is also quite unique to the work that we do with our growers, is that we do baseline and track energy, water, waste, and what's called the scope 1 and 2 emissions. I won't go too far down that rabbit hole. But all of our growers do have to report their irrigation water use, and all of our wineries have to report their water use. And especially on the winery side, we have an engineer that really helps validate that data. And then we track that year over year for improvements or changes. And if the changes aren't good, identifying why those changes are there. I can't tell you how often beginning to track that or starting to look at that data, even you might have been tracking it, but not looking at it. Suddenly a grower starts looking at it or a winemaker starts looking at it and they'll immediately catch leaks. Like, oh, whoa, what was that? It's just like, it's really, we say you can't manage what you don't measure. So we do, that's a really key part of what we do is tracking that water use over time. And then tied to that, I'll tie in another question here. I saw someone asking about groundwater sustainability, and we are actively involved in groundwater sustainability conversations here in Napa County. And the local kind of GSA group is really interested in supporting us because of all of the irrigation efficiency work that we do with growers. But I wanted to mention too, that forestry work is probably even more critical to our groundwater sustainability and our water availability, even than irrigation efficiency is, because forests are so heavily tied to our watershed health and our water storage and our water retention. So that's another element where you might not think that's about water, but it really, really is. But Ben, what more would you say there on ties between water and quality, especially?
Yeah, the big thing in water is the main tool that folks have to determine their quality, and especially within the season. And so they use that as a way to adjust the quality of the grapes. And so you have to have an efficient system to be able to then utilize those tools to deficit irrigation, like I mentioned, or some other ways of getting higher quality grapes throughout the season. And the question that you had mentioned, Anna, was actually in reference to groundwater recharge, which isn't currently happening in Napa Valley. We're looking at locations with the groundwater sustainability group And it's mainly around the underlying bedrock. You have to do it really in the right place with the right soils and the right geology below. And so there are some locations within the valley that have been identified, but no projects have been implemented. And honestly, going back to the indigenous management, like they recharged the aquifer underneath the Napa that we've been drawing from for years. And so our aquifer is actually in better shape than most other places in the state, and that's due to the millennia of indigenous management. Just always tying it back to that. I see two quick questions that I just want to do from Kyle about subsurface drip irrigation. Not that common in vineyards, mainly due to the soil management. It's very easy to get damaged, and then it's really hard to find leaks. So it's not that common in vineyards. And then you also asked about examples of vineyards grazing with poultry/birds. We do see it sometimes, especially with layers or even geese kind of paired with other grazing animals. But the one place that I've seen do like broilers, like meat birds down the alleys, they actually saw way too much nitrogen because the manure is so concentrated, and vines really don't like that much fertility. And so if you are going to be using birds in vineyards, you have to keep them moving or just have very low density.
There is a comment here from Joseph to Lillian, and I just wanted to read it for everyone. It says, her question around receiving a premium for regenerative grown grapes. He says, 100% yes. We've seen incredible growth and interest from consumers, retailers, and distributors on our new ROC wines now in market. These wines are at a 50% price increase from our core tier that is certified organic in the made with organic grapes category. So I thought that was really interesting, and always love to see the lively chat. I guess just a few more questions. Let's see if is there any other ones I missed in the chat? Ben, do you see any?
No, those were the kind of.
I think we've got to most of them. Well, I'll just leave it with one kind of last question for both you and Anna and Ben. What are some of the new approaches that you're seeing growers adopt, kind of like the cutting edge, just new stuff that's sort of out of the box? We talked about how grazing was really, kind of unique and very, it was very unique 10 years ago, and now it's a standard practice. What are some kind of new things that you're seeing that you think might become a standard practice in the next 5 or 10 years? And how are these practices increasing farms' resilience?
I'll mention a couple things. There was a study that came out, I'm going to say recently, but really maybe it's a year or so ago, on new approaches to trellising that can really help with climate adaptation, shading the fruit, reducing temperatures. And that relates to some really cutting edge work that's being done at Piscinus Ranch by Kelly Mulville. Hopefully I didn't space out, and Ben already talked about this, but he's doing work of really raising the fruit so that sheep can be in the vineyard year round. So looking at some new ways we can approach, from the start, when you have the ability to think about it from the start, some of the ways we can approach planning the vines to really plan ahead to some new resiliency. I think then there's things like Mimi Castile was at Rise. I think Evo at Gergich talked about this too. It's not all about tech. There's things like just having ground cover below the vines in high heat events can change the temperature by 30. I think Mimi showed 50 something degree difference by having ground cover versus no ground cover. And when you're having things like we did in 2020 of 115-degree days for several days in a row, that nature-based solution can be one of your biggest tools. But Ben, more ideas.
I always come back to biodiversity, because I think that oftentimes when you're driving through a viticultural area, it can often look pretty sterile, to be honest. You see some cover crop and some vines, and that's about it. Exposed soil underneath often. But a lot of people are starting to keep pollinator habitat every 10th row and not mowing that at all throughout the year, so that there is some living location for invertebrates and bugs to be living, because oftentimes those bugs can only move about 150 feet throughout their life, and so they need those islands throughout the monocrop to be able to survive. And then also giving up a little bit of vineyard space to also expand that biodiversity, either have it be a hedgerow or pollinator habitat, flowering crops throughout the year to really support that agroecosystem. Because once you take out the full systems approach to that agroecosystem is when you need to start spraying more. And that is what I think people are definitely moving away from, and hopefully becomes an industry standard, is really looking at the vineyard as an ecosystem and not just as a place for vines and dirt. So
amazing. I think I will leave it at that. That was a great place to end. Anna and Ben, thank you so much for being with us. It really is an honor to have, the level of experience and expertise that you have and sharing it openly with the community. It's really beautiful and it's really powerful. And it's, someone commented in here that it's so wonderful to see so many folks working so hard in this realm. And I really echo that. And it's great to be your partners in this. And we're excited to see what we learned from this trial. But again, thanks for being with us. Last housekeeping, again, we'll send an email out to everyone with the slides and the presentation. We will also be sending you all an invitation to our future webinars. We will have one with John Kempf coming up, as well as someone we're working with at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So keep an eye out for those. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. Also probably true for Ben and Anna. Is that true, guys?
Very true.
Yep. Yeah, you can find their emails on their website. But yeah, we're here and we're here to help. So thanks everyone for being with us.
thank you, Charlie.
Bye.
Bye.